You're listening to Compliance Insights, a podcast by Nimonik. We discuss all things related to compliance with environmental, health and safety, and quality rules. I'm Una Jefferson. In theory, the law is public. In practice, laws often incorporate privately developed standards and codes which are copyrighted and need to be purchased. Jonathan Brun is the CEO of Nimonik, so my boss, and I had him on the show today to discuss the accessibility of standards in Canada, the United States, and China. So, Jonathan Brun, hello. Thank you for coming on the podcast.
Hi, my pleasure.
So, I know this issue of the accessibility of standards and codes is one that's very close to your heart. Why does this matter, and how is access limited right now?
Well, I'd say it matters in a few ways, but if we kind of go back to the foundational sort of question, which is if we want people and organizations to respect the law that are issued by the different governments and governing bodies, they need access to it. And they always say you can't plead ignorance to law, but at the same time, if you can't access the law, then sometimes you don't have any choice but to be ignorant of it. And standards are in some ways part of the legal body. They aren't necessarily issued by government, but because they're heavily referenced by government, both in laws, regulations, and other documents, they often become de facto law. And if you can't access these standards, or if the cost to access the standards are prohibitive, then ultimately you're preventing people from accessing the law, which really goes around against some of the foundational parts of a just and available legal system.
Can you give our listeners one or two examples of standards that are incorporated into law in this way, but where the access is limited?
I mean, I think in Canada, which I'm more familiar with the Canadian situation, but in Canada, I believe there's something around 1,900 different standards that are actually referenced in laws, acts, or regulations. So like B139 Ontario is a standard for boilers, and this is referenced numerous times in different regulations in Ontario. And so if you own a boiler as a company, or potentially as an individual, but let's say a company, in theory, not only do you have to respect the regulation, but you have to respect this standard. And the standard is controlled by the Canadian Standards Association, and you have to go and buy a copy of this standard from that association. You can't access it for free anywhere. So that's just one example. There's many. There are some standards that cost in the thousands of dollars, and then there are some standards that are more lower cost, but nevertheless you have to pay for them. Some of the more expensive standards often have to do with the oil and gas industry, and these would be standards issued by the American Petroleum Institute down in the U.S., and they're recognized around the world as good practices, best practices for everything from drilling to refining, and they can cost thousands of dollars.
So what's the status of activism on this right now? I know that there's been some pushback. You've blogged about the work of Carl Malamud, who is operating in the United States, who has been going through progressive court challenges for posting standards online. And there's also been some public pressure in Canada. But where are we right now on this?
To my knowledge, and I'm not knee deep in this, to my knowledge, the only real activist I know of that's well known, at least, is Carl Malamud. And he has been publishing online standards and documents, things like the fire code, the building code, from a number of jurisdictions where that's not freely available. He's been publishing that online on his website, and he's been sued by a number of different governments and different standards bodies for copyright infringement. So he's definitely the most prominent and well-known activist, and he's doing good work to bring this sort of into the forefront. To my knowledge, there's no sort of organized movement around this, unfortunately. We've blogged about it. We've talked about it. I do think eventually the industry will need to, if we want to have a change, industry needs to act. But ultimately, it's really the government's job. And the one country where there does seem to be some activity in this direction is China. China announced a couple of years ago that they were going to make all standards freely available. And so this was both, there's kind of two types of standards in China. There's mandatory standards, and then there's voluntary standards. So think of the voluntary standards as best practices. And the Chinese government, which is we can criticize it for many things, but one thing it is very serious about is getting industry to improve, to push industry to make higher quality products, more complex products, safer and cleaner products. And this is a mammoth task, right, of epic scale. But one way you do that is by issuing standards and then forcing companies to respect them. And by making the standards freely available, you remove the excuse of companies to say, oh, well, I didn't have access to the standard, or, we couldn't afford it, or things like that. So they're making it freely available with really the specific goal of pushing industry forward. And I think that type of government initiative is ultimately what's going to make standards freely available. And China is doing a similar thing on papers that are published by researchers at university, which is sort of a connected but separate topic, where papers published by university professors that are paid by the state are copyrighted by different journals. And it's a bit of a same dynamic of capturing something that's actually paid for by the public and then trying to make money off of it.
I want to talk a bit about the business model of these standards. The statements put out by organizations like the American National Standards Institute say, that it is cheaper for government to allow standards bodies to set these, to develop these standards than to develop it themselves by, posting something and then getting comment from stakeholders. And so they argue that the cost of the standard is necessary to cover the cost of gathering and developing and formatting these standards. What's going on in China? Is the government just willing to... Is it more expensive for the government to provide these standards? Is that just a cost that they are willing to cover? What alternative business models are out there?
In China, yeah, it's basically a cost that the government's willing to cover. They view it as an investment in industry. As for whether it's cheaper for a standards body to create standards than it is for the government, honestly, it might be a little bit cheaper. I won't bother disputing that. But it's not, an order of magnitude cheaper. So if the government took over this type of responsibility, maybe that would inflate cost by 10 or 15%, but it's not going to substantially increase the cost. And even if it is cheaper for standards bodies to issue the standards, that doesn't necessarily mean that their cost recovery has to be on selling the standards. There's other ways that they could generate revenue. A lot of these standards bodies, they sell things like training around the standards. They sell services related to understanding how the standards are to be interpreted and applied. They sell software related to the standards. So there's lots of other ways that the standards bodies could make money off of the standards. They do have in-house expertise. They have access to a certain user base. So they don't necessarily need to make their money back by selling the standards. And in fact, I would argue that if they were to make the standards free, it would encourage more companies to adopt the standards and therefore more companies to require those additional services such as training and support around the standards. So I don't think that they need to sell the standards to make their money back. There's lots of other ways they can make money and cover their operating costs.
Have you seen any trend towards greater uptake of standards in China, or is it too early to say already?
Amongst our client base at Nimonik, at least, we get way more requests from Chinese companies for access to standards and for information about standards than we do anywhere else in the world. So I think, that's anecdotal. It's not a sort of broad scientific data point, but nevertheless, we definitely see the Chinese companies seem to take the standards very seriously, both the voluntary ones and the mandatory ones. And I would suspect that you would see that in other countries too, if we were to make standards freely available and if the government were to really push them and say, hey, these are the best in class standards. We really highly recommend that you adopt them. But we do have a tendency in the West to delegate this type of work to industry bodies. So you have standards bodies like the CSA, but you also have industry bodies. You have industry bodies for the steel industry, the mining industry. In Canada, there's the Canadian Mining Association. They have standards called Beyond Sustainable Mining or Towards Sustainable Mining. And you have Green Marine, which is an international standard related to environmental protection in the maritime industry, so shipping and ports. And that's done by industry for industry. And we tend to kind of delegate that often to industry, whereas in other countries like China, the government takes a more proactive role in pushing industries to improve.
There was a kind of a strange one-off last year in Canada where the National Energy Board decided that it would make the Canadian Standards Association standard number Z662, which is for oil and gas pipelines, publicly available for free for a year. And it called it a pilot project. And that's over now. And this kind of coincided with the peak of public interest in the Trans Mountain expansion. I'm not sure if it was related, but what do you think is going to come of this pilot project? What do you read into that?
Well, the only thing I can read into is they did as a small favor to the industry in Alberta. The CSA historically has made some standards available free of charge. They were obliged by the government a few years ago to make standards related to worker occupational health and safety freely available and not charge for them. And they did that, but they did it in the way that would make the standards as least useful as possible. And by what I mean by that specifically is that they put the standards online, but they put them online in a scanned format, meaning that you could not copy and paste from the documents. You could only view one page at a time. You couldn't download the documents. So it was like looking at an image of a page on the internet, and you can only look at one image at a time. So they basically did everything they possibly could to force the people to still buy the standard while theoretically respecting the government request to make these standards freely available. So the CSA has a track record of really doing everything they can to not make these standards available. And I think they did this in Alberta really just as a small favor. They figured, it's one standard, it's not a big deal. And I think they've since taken this offline, to my knowledge.
Yes, that is correct, I think. Okay, so it sounds like these small concessions haven't necessarily built up to any kind of momentum in Canada. What about the United States? Where do we stand on the court cases about copyright and standards development there?
Well, it's a good question. I know I honestly am not that familiar or up to speed in terms of which court cases are still in process and which are pending. But I know Carl Malamud lost one or two court cases that were significant, and these were specifically actually tied not even to standards but access to the law. I think it was in Georgia, but I might be mistaken. One of the U.S. states a couple of the U.S. states have signed agreements with private companies such as LexisNexis to publish the state regulations and codes and statutes online. And these organizations then claim copyright on those documents, which are entirely paid for by the public purse. And Carl Malamud had published some of these online and was sued by the state and lost. And I believe the argument turned around the fact that in addition to publishing the codes and statutes, they also published things like comments and jurisprudence that was linked into the codes and statutes. And they argued that was copyrightable. And therefore the whole thing was copyrightable. Again, I might be misinterpreting or misrepresenting this, but that's my understanding. I'm not aware of the state of the other lawsuits that are ongoing in the U.S. I know there's a whole bunch by different industry standard bodies. But I wouldn't be able to comment in an educated way on those.
Okay. Well, it'll be interesting to see how this all develops with these steps taken in China.
Yeah, I think China will take a lead here. And the real question is, somebody needs to get industry to come together to really demand these standards. But I fear it's really not going to happen unless government decides that this is an important issue. Because really, government's the only one who's going to be able to push the standards bodies to do this. The industry won't be able to pull everybody together in any sort of way to push standards bodies to do this. And standards bodies have zero incentive to do this, basically. They have a monopoly on these standards, and they're rent-seeking on the standards is basically what they're doing.
If government were to decide that this was a priority issue, do you see that happening through industry pressure or through public interest?
I think it would probably be through industry pressure. I mean, public is honestly not aware that there are such things as industry standards. The average consumer isn't really aware. They might see a sticker like Energy Saver or CSA on certain products, but beyond that, there's no real understanding unless you're knee deep in this stuff, which not very many people are, of the importance of these standards. So I think it's really up to industry. I've personally reached out to the Canadian government without much success on this issue. Obviously, Carl Malamud and others are fighting hard in the U.S., and hopefully there's some initiatives as well in Europe. But it's really up to government to do this. There's not really any other way about it.
All right. Well, thanks for your time, Jonathan.
My pleasure, Una. Have a great day.
You as well. Thank you for listening to Compliance Insights, a podcast by Nimonik. If you have any questions or comments or topics you'd like to hear discussed, we would love to hear them. So send me an email at ujefferson@nimonik.com. That's NIMONIK.com. You can find us and subscribe wherever you get your podcasts or online at mnemonic.com.